As the commander of the Continental Army, founding father, and first president of the United States, it's hard to think of a man who played a greater role in American history than George Washington. That is why I have taken it upon myself to create a short biography of this particular historical giant. He was not a perfect general, losing more battles than he won. He was far from a perfect man, owning hundreds of slaves at times despite having a personal dislike for the institution. And he was not a perfect president, but he was important nonetheless, and I hope that this biography will give you a deeper understanding of the time in which he lived and the man that he was. The main source that I used for this biography is the book Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. Let's begin. Washington had deep roots in the colonies because his great-grandfather moved to Virginia in 1656 and became a prominent man himself. He was a colonel in the army and a land speculator, which certainly foreshadowed George a few generations later. Washington was born February 11, 1732, into a family with 9 children. His father Augustine and mother Mary Ball had 50 slaves and 10,000 acres, so they were a fairly wealthy family, though not among the top class. His father was a justice of the peace, so he too foreshadowed his son's life in government. Washington also had a few brothers who inspired him. Firstly, his brother Robert was in the Royal Navy and fought against the Spanish, though he spent much of the time sick and away from battle. His other brother, Lawrence Washington, was in the House of Burgesses and married quite well, which improved his station in life greatly. This was inspiring to young George, so he worked constantly to improve himself and act as if he was from a greater class than he was by learning to dance, educating himself as best he could, and dressing well. He managed to learn despite not having a formal education, and by reading and by being taught a little bit in church. His brother's father-in-law was William Fairfax, who became quite a mentor and patron to Washington, and helped him get a position as a surveyor of Culpeper County, Virginia, after surveying Fairfax's land. His father died in 1743, and Washington inherited Ferry Farm, with 10 slaves, while Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek, which was subsequently named Mount Vernon. By the age of 20, George was successful in business and managed to get 2,315 acres to himself. After Lawrence died in 1752, George rented Mount Vernon from his brother's widow and eventually inherited the whole thing after her death. His first love was a woman named Mary Fairfax, who was married to his good friend George Fairfax. The two wrote letters to each other, but after he met his future wife, Martha Custis, the letters stopped. Martha was a widow with 2 children and a large fortune. The 2 children were loved by George because he and Martha were never able to have children of their own. Patsy Washington, his stepdaughter, died at a very young age, which was a tremendous hardship for the family. George's increasing status and powerful friends helped him to become a major in the British Army and commander of one of the 4 militia districts in the British and French as the British and French competed for control of the Ohio Valley. Washington was appointed to take back land and build an alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy. In 1754, Washington was made a lieutenant colonel, and at the Battle of Jumonville Glen, Washington's men and a group of natives killed 50 French soldiers, many of whom were scalped. When the French found these men, tensions rose and the French and Indian War began. In July of that same year, Washington surrendered to a superior French force and was stripped of his leading command. He resigned. However, in 1755, he accepted a position under General Braddock, trying to take the French fort Duquesne. In the battle, Braddock was killed and the English were defeated, but Washington served bravely, getting 2 horses shot out from under him, and bullet holes were found in his hat and coat. This garnered some respect for Washington, but still, the British were badly defeated with 300 killed and 300 wounded, versus 23 dead and 16 wounded from the French and Indians. Washington was made a colonel for his bravery. Later, he was made a brigadier in charge of one of the 3 brigades attacking Fort Duquesne, but the British abandoned it before any fight took place. A lot of the action he saw throughout the war was actually against Native Americans, and he was largely successful against them. After the British won the French and Indian War, Washington returned to his land and worked his slaves hard growing tobacco. Eventually he switched to grains, which required less slave labor. His slaves received 1 pair of clothes per annum, and weren't treated the worst in the colonies, but still, life under Washington was no walk in the park. In his free time, Washington hunted and attended plays. To earn extra money, he speculated on lands in the west, which meant that he was greatly angered by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains. As a respected military hero and large landowner, Washington held local offices and was elected to the Virginia Provincial Legislature, representing Frederick County in the House of Burgesses for 7 years, beginning in 1758. Tensions rose between the colonists and the British after the Boston Massacre of 1770. The British were raising taxes on the colonists to pay off war debts, which were actually much lower in the colonies than in England, but still, the colonies had no formal representation in Parliament, so they were against taxation without representation. The Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, and Coercive Acts all angered colonists, including Washington. The Coercive Acts were a response to the Boston Tea Party specifically, so the colonists were not entirely innocent. Washington attended the Second Virginia Convention in 1775, which is where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." Later, the British went to arrest some of the ringleaders of the early rebellion, such as Hamilton and Adams. Paul Revere rode to warn the British were coming, and the Minutemen, who were colonial militias, who were meant to be ready for battle in just 1 minute, prepared to meet them. At the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the British took an early victory, but by the day's end, the British had 273 wounded or killed versus 95 colonials. Washington was elected general of the newly founded colonial army, which was already a challenge because he had mostly militiamen who really needed to be whipped into shape, a task which he quickly got to work on. In 1775, it proved to be a rough year because he was undergunned and undermanned. Thankfully, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold took Fort Ticonderoga and did some fighting in Quebec, where they managed to steal some cannons and gunpowder. Washington even had to spread a rumor that he had much more gunpowder than he actually had, just to keep the spirits high. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was the next major battle, it was quite a significant British tactical victory, but they lost more men in the process. This is where British soldiers left the besieged Boston to face colonials on Breed's Hill. The British Navy at Falmouth burned 300 houses, which made colonists hate them even more. However, one should know that many still were loyalists and had good reason to be, with strong trade relations and the strongest navy in the world coming to their aid. Washington had no navy to work with until he hired privateers to steal British ships, allowing them to keep 1/3 of their value. He ended up with 6 ships, which became known as Washington's Navy. The truth was that militias were not good enough soldiers to face the British consistently, so Washington had to do what he could to discipline these men into a real army. He began whipping them for drunkenness and other disorders. His army could have been even stronger than it was, but his racist tendencies stopped him from allowing blacks to fight in the Continental Army, at least initially, because he feared black rebellion. Dunmore's proclamation by the British allowed slaves who escaped from rebellious masters to be made free if they joined the British Army. Washington was worn down by lack of soldiers, so he did allow some blacks to eventually fight. By the beginning of 1776, Washington only had about 10,000 men, but thankfully he was saved by the written word of Thomas Paine. Thomas published his pamphlet Common Sense on January 10th of 1776, which sold 150,000 copies in the first 3 months. It listed out all the ills done by the British and inflamed a rage within the colonies. Soon enlistments were skyrocketing and many more people supported the glorious cause. 1776 proved an incredibly vital year for Washington. He moved to capture cannons and guns from Fort Ticonderoga to Dorchester Heights on March 4th, overlooking Boston and the harbor. The British Commander General William Howe said, "My God, these fellows have done more work in 1 night than I could make my army do in 3 months." General Howe feared the death toll of a bombardment from the colonists' superior height advantage, so he evacuated the city of Boston, where 11,000 redcoats and some loyalists left on 102 British ships headed for Halifax, Nova Scotia. This was a massive victory for the colonists, who saw an early glimmer of hope. Washington then turned his sights on the heavily Tory New York. In preparation for the British attack, Washington had Fort Washington and Fort Lee built on the Hudson. In New York, the statue of King George III was knocked over and decapitated. Several loyalists were tarred and feathered, and resentment grew within the colonists. Soon things looked bleak, as 32,000 British and Germans approached New York, which only had about 10,000 men defending it, many of which were sick. King George had hired German Hessians, around 17,000 in number, to fight in the colonies. When the British and Germans landed, there was carnage. 300 Americans were killed and over 1,000 were captured. The Hessians and Highlanders were particularly cruel. Some chopped off American heads and put them on pikes. The Howe brothers proved to be tactically superior to Washington, and he had to retreat. The battle at Chatterton Hill was horrendously brutal. One of the soldiers rode at the carnage created by a single cannonball. First, it took the head of Smith, a stout, heavy man, and dashed it open. Then it took off Chilson's arm, which was amputated. It then took Taylor across the bowels. It then struck Sergeant Garrett of our company on the hip, and took off the point of his hip bone. What a sight that was to see, within a distance of 6 rods, these men with theory legs and arms and guns, all packed in a heap. End quote. The Battle of Brooklyn was a terrible loss for Washington. 2,837 soldiers surrendered to the Hessians, and Washington retreated across the Delaware with only 7,600 men. Howe decided not to follow or capture Philadelphia, as they generally didn't do much fighting in the winter in those days. He left just the Hessians to defend against the colonists while he built Trenton. On Christmas Day of 1776, one of the most iconic events of the Revolution happened. Washington led 2,400 men across the Delaware in small boats. Once on land, Washington and General Greene split up, with Washington going more inland and Greene following the river. They caught the Hessians so by surprise that there were 22 men killed, 84 wounded, and 900 captured, versus 2 Americans killed in battle and 5 killed by the cold. They had similar success at the Battle of Princeton. Soon their success came to a brutal end at the Battle of Brandywine, where the Continentals were flanked and opened a route for the British to go take Philadelphia. In this battle, 200 were killed, 500 wounded, and 400 captured, versus 9 killed and 500 wounded. When word of the British victory spread, many people fled from Philadelphia. Washington even sent Alexander Hamilton and Henry Lee to burn flour mills on the Schuylkill. Another loss at Germantown soon followed, and things were looking bad for the Continental Army. Good news soon came, though, because Franklin was in Paris trying to convince the French to join them in battle, which looked promising. At the Second Battle of Saratoga, General Burgoyne surrendered an entire army of 6,200 men on the 17th of October 1777. This helped encourage the French to join because the American cause seemed like it could be victorious. I should mention that they already had a few French volunteers with them, such as the famous Marquis de Lafayette. Native Americans fought on both sides as well, though the majority of Iroquois nations sided with the British, the Americans mainly allied with the Oneida. A tough winter followed in 1777 and early 1778, and Washington camped at Morristown. It snowed so bad that it was hard to get supplies to the soldiers, and many froze and starved. The colonial citizens also suffered, as heavy taxation was needed to support the war, and much was bought on credit. In February, a formal alliance between the French and the Americans was signed, which helped the Americans greatly. In 1780, the British won a major victory at Charleston, seizing the city along with 2,571 soldiers, 343 pieces of artillery, and 6,000 muskets. The loss was so substantial that Horatio Gates was recalled and Nathanael Greene returned to battle as commander of the Southern Front. Washington finally met with French generals Rochambeau and Ternay to show them the state of the war, which boosted Washington's morale, but his good mood would soon be soured, as in September of 1780, a traitor would be discovered. Since his heroic fighting in Quebec and at Saratoga, Benedict Arnold had become a well-known name. Sadly, at Saratoga, he had been injured and wasn't able to command for a while. He was passed up for a major general position that he deserved over the other men involved, so by the time Washington made him a general, he was quite bitter. When he became the military commandant in Philadelphia, he met a young loyalist named Peggy Shippen, whom he fell madly in love with. She connected him to some British officers through a friend, Major Andre. Arnold said that he would deliver West Point to Sir Henry Clinton in exchange for 6,000 pounds sterling because Arnold was very indebted. Major Andre ended up getting caught by the colonials while carrying papers from Arnold, which proved his treachery. Washington was in town and he sent Hamilton and McHenry to capture him, but Arnold was too quick and escaped. Major Andre was very brave and smiled at all of his friends and bowed and said that his last request was simply, "Nothing but to request you will witness to the world that I die like a brave man." With his last words, he tied a handkerchief around his eyes and tightened the rope himself. The years of fighting took its toll on the soldiers, and 1,300 soldiers on the Pennsylvania line mutinied and killed their officers. Washington had a few men shot, and the rest were forced to witness their bodies. Finally, at the siege of Yorktown, General Cornwallis surrendered, and the war was mostly over, though it wasn't officially ended until the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Slaves who had escaped were returned to their masters, including 8 of Washington's. He had served as commander-in-chief for a total of 8.5 years and was ready to go home. Quoting Washington alive, He had lost more battles than he had won, had botched several through strategic blunder, and had won at Yorktown only with the indispensable aid of the French army and fleet. End quote. Still, without him the war likely would have been lost. Washington is often compared to Cincinnatus, who was a Roman citizen who was made dictator, who fought off Rome's enemies and then relinquished his power and returned to his farm. After the war, Washington did just that and returned to Mount Vernon to catch up on some much-needed time with his wife and his books. It wasn't long before the colonies needed him again. Many issues plagued them, such as slavery and war debts. On the issue of slavery, many anti-slavery groups were forming and protesting. Washington privately wrote that he disliked slavery, but he owned many and wouldn't take a public stand against it, even as it became more popular. He wrote a letter saying that he hoped Congress would abolish slavery, but do it slowly to lessen the blow on the slaveholders and the mostly uneducated slaves alike. This, of course, was an easy stance to take for a man who owned hundreds of slaves. There was also the issue of colonists moving further west and encroaching on native lands. Congress told colonists to stop crossing the border, but it couldn't be stopped because of the riches that awaited in the west. The colonial government was quite inefficient. Again quoting from Chernow, quote, "This legislative body required a quorum of 9 states to do business, operating on a one-state, one-vote basis, and could pass major laws only with a unanimous vote. The United States wasn't a country, but a confederation of 13 autonomous states, loosely presided over by Congress. Many states issued land taxes to cover the costs of the war, and farmers got angry and began to rebel, such as in Massachusetts. George Washington didn't have a great philosophical mind for constitution drafting that other founders had, but he did have the ability to lead, so he was made president of the Constitutional Convention. Soon, clauses like the 3/5 Slave Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause were put in place. At the same time, the Federalist Papers were secretly written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Against them stood the Anti-Federalist. Washington was more of a Federalist in philosophy. Once the Constitution was ratified, it was decided that the newly formed United States needed a president, and Washington was unanimously elected. He faced challenges such as the Whiskey Rebellion, which happened because there was a tax put on the sale of spirits, while most farmers turned their excess grain into whiskey. Washington managed to put down the rebellion without bloodshed. Division was forming with the government, and Jefferson and Hamilton took opposite sides and became enemies. These battles became a nuisance for Washington, who tried to keep the government together as best he could. There was also the major issue of war debts, and Hamilton created the first central bank to try to solve this financial crisis. A series of wars began against Native Americans like the Miami and Wabash tribes after raids had taken place against settlers and trade routes, but the militias weren't quite up to the task. The Miami won a battle against the young Americans where 900 men were casualties versus 150 natives. It became increasingly clear that a standing army was necessary. Washington was re-elected for a second term unanimously. He still had to deal with the faction in government, which was worsened by the Jay Treaty, which increased trade with Britain during the French Revolution. Washington declared neutrality during the French Revolution, and despite some initial interest, he soon found the French had become too radical and bloodthirsty. Washington retired after 8 long years as president of the newly founded United States. He returned to Mount Vernon to live out the rest of his days with his wife. He passed away on December 14th of 1799 and is remembered as an essential piece to America's founding, despite his shortcomings. Thank you.